Hello and welcome to GreenFleet Talks. My name's Kate Armitage and I'm your host for our discussion today, and I'm delighted to be joined by Matthew Waller, EV Solutions Director for FleetCor.
Hey Kate, how's it going?
Hi Matthew. Yeah, very well, thank you. Thank you very much for joining us today. Now, you and I, the topic for discussion today, Matthew, is the challenges that SME fleets are currently facing.
Yeah.
But FleetCor actually offer a number of services around fleet electrification. So to kick us off, why don't you give us a quick overview?
Yeah, of course. So actually, it's been quite an exciting time to be within FleetCor. I think as many people are aware, FleetCor is one of the leaders in B2B payment solutions. And so we've had a long heritage now across, I guess, transport payments infrastructure. So one of our bigger brands in the UK is All Star Business Solutions. But we've actually made several investments, including into companies like Plugsurfing, which is one of the leading suppliers of roaming solutions for fleet electrification across Europe, and also now Mina, which offer, I think, a very recognizable home energy payment solution for EV drivers within the UK. And so we've managed to bring both of those solutions under our wing. I think Plugsurfing, All Star, and Mina combined to be a really great solution. And we've made other investments into companies like ZapMap, which obviously is probably the most recognizable solution for searching and paying for charging on the road via their ZapMap app. And in the US, we've obviously made some other investments, a company called Motor that does connected vehicle data, specifically around electric vehicle fleets as well. And so what we're trying to do is mold together kind of the best in class capabilities across a wide area of different solutions in order to make that transition really easy for our customers. And I think that's because our customers see us and trust us within, I guess, a fueling and a transport space. And they want to see us as that one-stop shop, because transitioning towards EV is obviously a really difficult challenge for a lot of fleets. And I think the more they can single source their approach to that transition, the easier it then is for them to take the first steps.
Yeah, Matthew, this single sourcing is really quite an interesting topic, because basically with the different parts of the business, you can cover off home charging, workplace charging, and charging
Exactly.
when you're on the go. And it's also that consolidated view, as you said, of the billing and the payments, which is so important for business fleets. Okay, so thank you. That's very, very helpful. When we think about SMEs, the current cost of living crisis and the current energy crisis is definitely going to be taking its toll on smaller businesses.
Yeah.
And the concern is that as a result, they may be putting off the move to zero emission vehicles due to their high upfront costs. What's your take on this, and what advice would you give SMEs?
I think it's important to recognise that there are probably quite a few upfront costs that are going to impact particularly smaller businesses. So I guess the cars themselves tend to be a little bit more expensive, although we've seen moves to bring that price down. I think Tesla most recently is kind of starting a bit of an EV price war, which in the end should make, but for both consumers and businesses alike, electric vehicles a lot more accessible. And hopefully that then starts to impact the economy end of the market as well. But there's other things that I think need consideration as part of that total upfront cost to kind of set off on the journey. Things like infrastructure, so making sure you've got charge points both at employee homes if you want to have them there, or at a workplace in a car park or at your depot, as an example. But actually, crucially, how you access infrastructure on the road at the same time. And I don't think you can underestimate the education required to get a driver into an EV car as well, or an EV van even, and understanding how they're going to use that and sort of transitioning their behaviors across from sort of the fueling world into now a charging and a little and often charging environment. There's obviously a few more other solutions to manage, but I think the benefits of transitioning towards EV are so extensive now. Obviously, the technology is improving year on year and at a really rapid pace, that I think we do need to start now, and fleets really should be assessing this and making the move within 2023, because the situation and the landscape is going to change quite significantly as we move towards 2030. And I think it's going to take some time where fleets need to completely decarbonize by the time they reach 2030. It's going to take some time, and you're going to need to do some learnings and some trial and error in order to get there. think the business case is obviously generally there. There's often lower fueling costs versus petrol and diesel, although with the energy price guarantee and other shifting circumstances due to Ukraine, obviously that equation has flipped back and forth. But I think we will still see a lower total cost of ownership for EV through things like reduced maintenance bills, the zero or discounted car tax, government energy grants, or other ways that obviously you can benefit from having EVs as part of the fleet. And obviously they crucially help towards emissions targets, which are going to be, if not mandatory today, mandatory in the future. But I think from the fleets that we work with, I think the key for success is taking small incremental steps to move forward. So rather than burdening yourself with super high upfront costs to transition every vehicle across the fleet to EV, install a ton of charge points and work everything out sort of on the fly, if you can sort of start to access the low-hanging fruit from a fleet perspective, who are your drivers that are best placed and most willing to go into an electric vehicle? Have you got vehicles that on a daily cycle are much more suited to being electric, where they can return back to base and charge up at particular points on the road? Taking those small decisions and maybe carving out 5 to 10% at a time and transitioning that way, and keeping yourself and it kind of accepting that you're going to be within a mixed fleet environment, I think is really important. And so our focus within FleetCore and more generally within All-Star, from a UK perspective, has been to target and help those mixed fleets. So where they've got a couple of EVs and are now looking for something that can suit both their fueled vehicles and their electric vehicles, how can we enable those to work in tandem so that it seamlessly helps that transition across?
And Matthew, I mean, because certainly when we talk about electric vehicles, that's not a new technology now. It's been around for 10 plus years. So most fleets have put their toe in the water a little bit, and some have gone much further than that and really are in this mixed fleet situation where they need support for both electric and conventional vehicles. SMEs may be a little bit behind on that curve, but I think your advice to start small, to take the low-hanging fruit, it's really, there's a lot of merit in getting that learning, that on the ground learning of what running an electric vehicle within a fleet means. What are the challenges? What are the barriers? What are the pros? And starting to see those total cost of ownership benefits coming through on the books as well.
And if we're talking about smaller fleets of, say, 5 vehicles or smaller, it needn't be replacing an entire vehicle on the fleet. It could be just the experience of going and hiring one for a weekend and understanding across your routes where it is you would charge, from an on-the-road basis, going and talking to vendors like All-Star as an example, or others that might be hardware installation vendors, to understand, can I get a charge point installed at home? How much would that cost me? What cards are available? Where could I charge on the All-Star network as an example? How much would it cost me to get chargers installed in my workplace car park? Taking those learnings away and then actually using an electric vehicle for, if you can, an extended period of time to understand how it would meet your needs and where the biggest barriers and challenges would be, that's a small enough step to get you going. And then the next step might be actually getting an electric vehicle on and putting it in the right place at the right time to be successful.
Yeah, I agree. And of course, the longer you leave it before you start this journey, the more compressed it's going to be as we get closer to 2030. So it could become quite stressful. So one of the other things that we picked up on is that recent research from Lloyds Bank showed that 77% of small businesses currently do not have a net zero strategy, and 34% said that this was down to a lack of knowledge. So where do SMEs go to get this support and information before embarking on this decarbonisation journey?
I think it's always natural that they're going to turn towards either local or central government first, because obviously that's where a lot of the drive towards decarbonisation is coming from, is through central policy. And so there are things available like infrastructure grants, other resources like energy efficiency assessments and other funding efforts towards energy saving equipment that I think are available both at a national, regional, local level to help businesses, sort of small, medium and large, take the first steps on that journey. There are also if you talk to third parties, there's a growing number of sustainability consultancies that can help a business develop that strategy. But I think fundamentally, it's probably allocating some time, and time is obviously quite a precious thing within an SME environment, but dedicating some time, whether you're going to work with a third party or not, or whether you're going to use government resources, having that time allocated is really important to kind of understand what are the steps you're going to take and how is that going to remain relevant for your business as a whole. And I don't think implementing a strategy doesn't have to be expensive, but at the end of the day, what the business puts in is probably what it's going to get out in terms of how quickly you get there and how painful it is overall. And so one of the other things I would suggest is you're probably already working with, as a fleet, a load of different providers across, use All-Star as an example again, but fueling, across service maintenance and repair, telematics as an example. You can be speaking to all of those providers today from a fleet decarbonisation perspective to understand what does good look like, what solutions are available to you in the market, what speed could you, what's the realistic speed and pace of change that you could expect within a decarbonisation effort. And that will all be central pillars towards your strategy moving forwards. And I think that helps ground it with the providers that you might already work with to help you take the steps forward.
Yeah, great, Matthew. And I know also, of course, decarbonisation goes across the whole business. It's not just fleet specific. So making sure that you're working in harmony with the rest of the business, I think, is quite important. Sourcing your electricity from renewable sources, which will give you the best possible, the lowest carbon footprint. Yeah.
And I think there's also a ton of resources now, GreenFleet being one of them, which are somewhat educational within the industry, that you can go and we can consume content like podcasts, like the roundtables that obviously you guys run, to kind of get a view of what other fleets are doing and how they've approached their strategy in order to learn and drive a better way of doing things.
It's so important, and we've had some great case studies at GreenFleet, which is really highlights the moves that are being made by some smaller businesses as well. So I like talking about charging infrastructure. So I'm going to ask you, what charging considerations should an SME take on board before they buy or bring electric vehicles onto the fleet?
Yeah, and I think infrastructure is obviously our hot topic as well from an All-Star perspective, because we've got one of the now largest independent roaming networks that we offer to fleets within the UK. And I think the common issues and common considerations we come up against when we're speaking to fleets are clearly charging an EV vehicle. It's just not as simple as ICE fueling overall today. You can rock up at a petrol station in an ICE vehicle and be gone in probably under 2 minutes if you're pretty efficient about things. But there are some cases and some individuals and some drivers on a fleet where it may still remain quite easy for them to own and operate an electric vehicle. And actually the more easier ones are where they've got the infrastructure and the ability to charge at home, we found on a case-by-case basis, because actually that 2 minutes that you might spend at a fuel station is completely removed from the journey, because all you're doing is turning back up at home, plugging in and forgetting, and then you're able to go about your day on the next day completely fine. I think the more complicated ones are where there are stops required on the road, and the on-the-road infrastructure I think is improving. But if you're having to deal with, for example, AC chargers on a daily basis, that's probably going to require a fairly lengthy stop versus the 2 minutes that I've just described at a fuel station. It could be a case of a couple of hours. We have taken a very specific focus for fleets of offering access to infrastructure that is 97-98% fast, rapid and ultra rapid charges within our network, because we recognize that fleet drivers, van drivers, company car drivers, they're accessing this infrastructure as part of their working day. Yeah. And so it's really important that they get off the road and back on it as quickly as possible with a full tank of electricity or a fully charged battery. And so that's why we've taken that specific focus with our on-the-road network. I think if we're looking at how fleets can take better considerations about the access to that infrastructure and the different charging patterns that might happen, we've seen specific fleets that we've spoken to completely change their shift patterns as a working directive in order to make sure that when they're rolling vans on and off, for example, a delivery fleet, they've got the ability to charge up those vans in between different shifts. So it might be that your typical working pattern within an ICE vehicle perspective is everybody returns to base at once and everybody switches over. That I think is probably not going to be possible for most electric van fleets today. And I think what you might have to do is end up staggering shifts, that you get one driver come back, stick the van on charge, wait for the next driver to come back and rotate, rather than having everybody come back to base at once and then go out again. And I think it's those organizational and behavioral changes, which aren't technical things, and they don't cost any money really to implement long term, but those are the things that will drive a better outcome in terms of success for fleets when they start to transition. We spoke briefly about drivers taking vehicles home overnight and charging at home. That's obviously more convenient for drivers and for companies, but I think there's a bit of a funding challenge with the AER today, and it's just obviously changed to 9 pence per mile, that you need to find the right way to be able to incentivize drivers to participate in that behavioral change. Because at the end of the day, with the energy price guarantee as it is, even if you're driving relatively efficiently and getting 3 miles per kilowatt hour, that's still 11 pence per mile, or 11.3 pence per mile based on the energy price guarantee. And so your drivers are losing money if you're paying at the AER. And so
they won't do it, Matthew.
Exactly. And
why would they?
Of drivers handing back keys for electric vehicles because they don't like the behavior change for a start, and it ends up losing the money. So if you can remove those barriers by providing better education, better access to charging capability, and allow them to charge the vehicles at home when it's going to make the most sense for them, it makes it 100% easier to start out on the transition.
And being able to bill the cost of that electricity back to the employer, so the absolute cost, so that they're not out of pocket, is really advantageous. And you talked about operational change, which is something that I come across a lot. So on one hand, when people are first looking to switch out or introduce an electric vehicle, they may look for a single vehicle, a single petrol or diesel vehicle, and say, can I take that off the road and replace it with an electric vehicle with no operational changes required? And that's common, but it will only get you so far. There will come a point, whether that's at 50% electrification or 80%, but there will come a point where you have to make operational change. And that's actually, I'm going to say, an advantage for an SME, because SMEs are more nimble. They are more able. They got the agility to say, right, we're making a process change. As of Monday, this is going to happen. And, getting approval for that is relatively straightforward, particularly if it's a decision that's come from the top down. So if the MD says we're going electric, my goodness, so those businesses are going to go electric. And
I think it's one of those things, we go back to the start of our conversation. We talked about taking those small steps, and you talked about getting a single vehicle. But that doesn't mean that single vehicle needs to do the same thing every day. I think you can use that same single vehicle as a test bed across the rest of the fleet and switch it out into different shift patterns, different routes that it might need to do. And you can actually understand very quickly from a trial and error perspective what changes you're going to need to make from an operational perspective, so that when all of those routes start to turn electric, you've got the ability to do it without it causing you any operational loss overall.
Absolutely loads there, Matthew. Thank you. Just finally then, aside from zero emission vehicles, thinking a bit broader, what other ways can small firms reduce emissions from their transport operations?
I think there's multiple ways, and a lot of them, to be honest, are fairly common sense once you start looking into it. It's, can you reduce overall energy consumption through energy efficient equipment, building management systems, other waste reduction measures? There's carbon offsetting's been around, and carbon credits have been around for a long time now. And that's another way that obviously indirectly you can start to decarbonize your transport operations. There's obviously some slightly longer term, more innovative ways, I think, that you can approach the situation. So things like shared mobility. And when I say shared mobility, that's quite a nebulous term, I think, out there in the industry, and means different things to different people. But it could be as simple as a carpool for your employees to get to work. Fundamentally, if you're reducing the number of vehicles that need to be on the road in order to run and operate your business, that's a good thing, regardless of whether they're electric or petrol or diesel, to be honest, because that's just less emissions overall. And obviously you save on other things like the actual cost of the fuel and parking fees. So there's incentives to do that really anyway. You and I now are speaking on a video conferencing tool. And I think with COVID-19 over from 2020 and obviously moving forwards, video conferencing has become obviously a lot more accepted for businesses. So rationalizing the number of face-to-face meetings that you need to have obviously is another way to save money, but also saves emissions because you and I haven't had to travel today to meet each other to fulfill this podcast. And then there's other areas where I think it's optimization rather than transition. So implementing vehicle connectivity or telematic solutions or fleet management solutions help you to improve things like idling time, vehicle utilization, vehicle right sizing, vehicle routing. All of these things, you're not necessarily having to transition individual vehicles, but the vehicles that you are using, you're suddenly in a position where they're more efficient, they're being used more effectively. And actually, from a utilization perspective, you might be able to decrease the overall size of your fleet, because if you can take a vehicle from being 50% utilized to 100%, that's one extra vehicle that you might be able to remove across the entire fleet. And that will help with other things like fueling costs, maintenance costs, and overall driver safety as a whole. And so insurance costs might improve as a secondary factor to that as well. So I think there's a lot of benefits to start to tease out if you haven't taken one of those steps already. And some of them are easier than others. I guess implementing a carpool system for employees to arrive at work is probably quite simple in the whole scheme of things. But there is a lot of pragmatic steps there, I think, that rather than just looking at electric vehicles and working out how we go fully electric, that you can take to start decarbonising overall.
And Matthew, kind of bringing the conversation full circle as well, some of those things that you've talked about, like telematics, like optimization and monitoring, will also make it much easier on the decision-making process when you are ready to look at zero-emission vehicles.
Correct.
And understanding how vehicles are performing and what they're doing is crucial to that.
And I think when we've attended roundtables in the past, one of the questions is always what data has been the most valuable in order to help you manage and best approach a transition. And I think the best way of accessing data is through vehicle connectivity, telematics, and fleet management systems, because they don't lie. I don't think in a lot of cases they fully capture what's going on operationally on the ground. Often in excruciatingly granular detail. But that's all very, very powerful then in helping to make that assessment of, can I change this car into an electric vehicle, and what do I need to change in order to do it? And it's kind of future-proofing. We've talked about doing a bit of trial and error with EVs. You can kind of mitigate the error part of that by having a lot of data in hand before you start making that or start approaching that transition.
And the number of times that data has disproved what the business believed was happening as well.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I said. The data doesn't lie. It's
yeah. Well, Matthew, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you this morning.
Likewise. Yeah. Thanks,
Thank you
Kate.
very much for joining me. Thank you very much to Fleet Core as well. And thank you for watching. So please tune in to GreenFleet 365 again soon.